10:25 in the morning, June 4, 1942. 14,000 feet above the Central Pacific, a single-engine dive bomber tips forward into a near-vertical dive. Inside the cockpit, a 33-year-old lieutenant commander named Richard Halsey Best watches the ocean rush upward through his windscreen, the horizon tilting sideways, his oxygen mask cold against his face. Below him, spread across the water like gray toy ships from this altitude, sits the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force, a vessel he was never supposed to be diving toward. Seconds earlier, Best had been lined up on a different target entirely, following the same orders as every other pilot in his squadron. Then he saw something no one else seemed to notice and made a decision no one had briefed him to make. Now there is no time left to reconsider it. His altimeter unwinds. His airspeed climbs past 200 knots. Somewhere below, sailors on that flagship's deck are still moving through their morning routines, unaware that history is now a few thousand feet above their heads and closing fast. In roughly 20 seconds, Richard Best will release a single bomb that historians will spend the next 80 years arguing about, not whether it hit its target, but whether the entire outcome of the Pacific War quietly depended on him choosing, in a single instant, to break formation and dive somewhere nobody told him to. No superior officer ordered this dive. No plan accounted for it. Whatever happens in the next 20 seconds happens because one man, alone in a cockpit, trusted his own judgment over his own orders. How did an entire war arrive at this exact moment, hanging on the judgment of one man in one cockpit? To understand it, the story has to go back 6 months to a harbor in Hawaii that no longer looked like the safest naval anchorage in the Pacific. December 7th, 1941 leaves the United States Pacific Fleet in ruins at its own moorings. Battleship Roe burns under a low column of black smoke visible for miles, oil slicks catching fire on the surface of the harbor around men still swimming for shore. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, nearly 2,400 Americans dead before breakfast. In Tokyo, the attack is celebrated as a masterstroke, and across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Japanese forces advance in a rolling wave of victories that few military planners anywhere believed possible in so short a time. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all falling within months. Yet the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Yamamoto, does not celebrate for long. Photographs from this period show a man who looks less like a conqueror than an accountant reviewing figures he does not like. He understands something his own government prefers not to hear. Japan's advantage is temporary, built on a head start that American industrial capacity will eventually erase, ship by ship, factory by factory, until the numbers no longer favor Japan at all. Yamamoto has studied that industrial capacity firsthand, having lived and studied in the United States years earlier, and he privately estimates Japan's window of advantage in months rather than years. Yamamoto has one strategic option left that might change that math permanently: force the remaining United States Navy carriers into a single, decisive battle, and destroy them while Japan still holds superior numbers and more experienced pilots. His resolve to act quickly hardens in April 1942, when 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet strike Tokyo and other Japanese cities in a raid that causes only modest physical damage but delivers a psychological shock felt at the highest levels of the Japanese military. If American bombers can reach the home islands once, they can potentially do it again. And Japanese naval planners who had previously resisted Yamamoto's Midway proposal now approve it with new urgency, eager to eliminate the American carriers capable of launching such a raid before it happens a second time. He selects his target, a small atoll named Midway, barely a few square miles of sand and coral, close enough to Hawaii that the Americans cannot afford to ignore an invasion of it. To most of his own staff, the island itself looks worthless. No resources, no population worth occupying. But Yamamoto understands its true purpose is not the island at all. It is the bait. If Japan threatens Midway, the U.S. Navy has no choice but to sail out and defend it directly into a trap Yamamoto has spent months designing. He assembles the largest fleet Japan has ever sent to sea for the operation, 4 fleet carriers at its spearhead, screened by battleships, cruisers, and submarines, over 200 vessels total, spread across the ocean in a web meant to be inescapable. On paper, it looks unstoppable. There is only one flaw baked into the plan, one Yamamoto does not yet know about, and will not learn about until it is far too late to matter. The enemy has already read it. Before this story can reach that flaw, though, it needs to answer a different question first. Who is the man about to dive on that flagship, and how does a peacetime Navy pilot end up carrying, however unknowingly, this much weight on his shoulders? Richard Halsey Best is born in 1910 in Bayonne, New Jersey, the son of an Army officer, and grows up moving between postings the way most military children do. Never quite settling, always adapting to a new base, a new school, a new set of neighbors who will not be neighbors for long. He enters the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in the late 1920s, graduating into a peacetime Navy. Still uncertain whether aircraft carriers represent the future of naval warfare or an expensive experiment that budget-conscious admirals might eventually abandon. Best chooses aviation anyway, at a time when naval aviators are still a small, somewhat unproven fraternity within a battleship-dominated Navy, and eventually specializes in dive bombing, a discipline that demands equal parts nerve and precision. Pilots in this role train to point their aircraft almost straight down at a moving target from more than 10,000 feet, holding the dive through anti-aircraft fire, timing the release to within a fraction of a second, and pulling out of the dive before the ocean fills the windscreen entirely. A maneuver that subjects both aircraft and pilot to forces the human body was never designed to absorb repeatedly. It is, by the standards of 1930s naval aviation, one of the most physically demanding and mentally exacting jobs in the fleet, and Best earns a reputation among his peers as exceptionally skilled at it. Respected, occasionally blunt with subordinates and superiors alike, known for an intensity and a willingness to argue tactics with men who outrank him, traits that some colleagues find inspiring and others find difficult to work under. By 1942 he commands Bombing Squadron 6, VB-6, aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, one of only 3 American fleet carriers left in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor, responsible for roughly 24 pilots whose survival depends, in no small part, on decisions he makes in the air. Life aboard Enterprise in the spring of 1942 does not resemble the popular image of naval heroism. It resembles routine punctuated by fear. Pilots rise before dawn to the smell of aviation fuel and reheated coffee, sit through briefings in cramped, ready rooms thick with cigarette smoke, study silhouette charts of Japanese ships until the shapes become second nature, and climb into aircraft that offer no armor, minimal radio reliability, and a return trip to a carrier deck that might not be where the pilot left it if the ship has since changed course to evade attack. A missed rendezvous, a wrong compass heading, or a few extra minutes burned circling in search of the enemy can mean the difference between a routine landing and a fuel gauge reading empty over open water with no ship in sight. Best has already flown combat missions during the early carrier raids of 1942 against Japanese-held islands in the Marshalls and Gilberts, missions that cost him fellow pilots and taught him, in ways no peacetime exercise ever could, how unforgiving this new form of warfare actually is. He has watched aircraft simply not return to the deck count, their fate never fully confirmed, and has learned to compartmentalize that uncertainty well enough to fly again the next morning. He is not, in the spring of 1942, an untested rookie stepping into his first taste of combat. He is a commander who has already watched the arithmetic of dive bombing, altitude, speed, timing, luck, decide who comes home and who does not, and who carries that knowledge into every briefing without saying much about it out loud. What he does not yet know is that the most consequential mission of his career is still weeks away, and that it will begin not with a clear order, but with confusion over an order that have already been given. That confusion starts with a message intercepted in a windowless room half a world away. At Pearl Harbor, in a windowless basement office nicknamed Station HYPO, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts live on cigarettes and cold coffee, poring over intercepted Japanese naval traffic for weeks on end, hunting for the meaning behind a designation that keeps recurring, AF. Rochefort is almost certain AF means Midway, but almost is a dangerous word to bring to an admiral who has only 3 carriers left in the entire Pacific and cannot afford to gamble them on a hunch, however educated. So Rochefort's team engineers a test simple enough to be almost elegant. Midway's garrison transmits an uncoded radio message reporting that its freshwater distillation plant has broken down. Days later, a Japanese intercept references AF suffering exactly that same water shortage. The confirmation is unambiguous, and in that basement, exhausted men allow themselves a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. Nimitz now knows where Yamamoto intends to strike, and roughly when, an advantage no American fleet commander has yet possessed against this particular enemy in this particular war. He orders every available carrier to Midway, including the Yorktown, a ship still trailing oil and smoke from battle damage sustained weeks earlier at the Coral Sea, now being patched together in a repair effort compressed from a projected 90 days down to 72 hours. Welders working in scaffolding bolted directly over open hull breaches through the night. If Yamamoto's plan depends on secrecy, that plan is already broken before a single Japanese ship crosses the horizon toward Midway. Though nobody aboard those ships, from admiral to deckhand, has any reason yet to suspect it. Aboard Enterprise, none of this intelligence reaches pilots like Richard Best in any detail. What reaches them is simpler and more urgent. Prepare for a major engagement. Location and timing classified even from most of the men who will fly it. Briefings kept deliberately vague to protect the secret Rochefort's team fought so hard to obtain. Best and his squadron run through briefings on Japanese ship silhouettes, rehearse dive bombing approaches on empty ocean where no enemy has yet appeared, and wait. The specific dread of men who know a fight is coming without knowing precisely when or against what. On June 3rd, American search planes based on Midway spot elements of the Japanese invasion force approaching from the west, and the picture sharpens. On June 4th, before dawn, Japanese carrier aircraft launched their first strike against Midway's airfield and defenses, and a battle that will decide the balance of the Pacific War formally begins. Though almost no one on either side yet understands how quickly it will be decided, or by how narrow a margin. Nagumo's carriers close on Midway exactly on schedule, and the first wave of Japanese bombers strikes the atoll's defenses hard just before dawn, anti-aircraft fire rising from the ground in a thickening curtain of black bursts, fuel dumps and hangars catching fire along the runway. American Marine fighters based on the island, flying aircraft outclassed by the Japanese zero in every meaningful respect, rise to meet the attack anyway and are cut down in minutes. A handful of survivors limping back to a damaged airfield with aircraft too shot up to fly again that day. It looks, in these opening hours, like the operation Yamamoto designed is unfolding without a hitch. The island's defenses smashed exactly as planned and an invasion force still steaming up from behind to finish the job. Then Nagumo's strike leader radios back a request that will begin unraveling everything. Midway's defenses are not yet broken, and a second strike against the island is recommended. Nagumo, following standard doctrine, orders the aircraft he had held in reserve, armed with torpedoes in case American ships appeared, rearmed instead with bombs for a second strike on the island. Deck crews aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu begin the physically punishing work of striking torpedoes back into magazines and hauling land bombs up in their place, a process that leaves ordnance stacked across hangar decks in the open for longer than anyone intends. It is routine, disciplined work. It is also, though no one aboard those ships can see it yet, creating the single most dangerous condition a carrier can be caught in. Then a scout plane radios something Nagumo did not expect this early. Enemy surface ships, sighted where Japanese planning assumed none would appear for hours yet. Nagumo has no confirmation whether those ships include a carrier, and for nearly 40 minutes the answer does not come, because the scout's radio equipment is unreliable and its follow-up reports arrive in fragments, each one only partially answering the question that actually matters. On Akagi's bridge, officers stare at a chart with an unconfirmed contact marked on it, unable to plan around a threat whose full shape they cannot yet see. Every minute of silence from that scout plane is a minute Nagumo's rearming crews continue their work below, hauling bombs and torpedoes between magazine and hangar in a race against a clock only one side of this battle can hear ticking. When confirmation finally does arrive, a carrier among the enemy ships, Nagumo faces an impossible decision with his hangar decks mid-changeover, some aircraft armed with bombs meant for a second strike on Midway, others half-converted back toward torpedoes meant for a ship no one had confirmed until minutes ago. Naval doctrine of the era offers him, in theory, two paths. He could launch immediately with whatever mixed, partially armed aircraft already on deck, accepting a weaker, uncoordinated strike in exchange for speed, or he could hold, finish rearming his aircraft properly, recover the Midway strike force now returning low on fuel, and launch one unified, overwhelming blow once everything is ready. Nagumo chooses the second path. It is the textbook decision, the one nearly any trained naval officer in his position would have made with the same information available to him at that moment, favoring concentrated striking power over an improvised half measure. It is also, in these specific circumstances, decks already crowded with returning aircraft, hangars already stacked with ordnance from the earlier rearming, no time left to disperse any of it, about to become the most expensive decision of the entire war, not because it was reckless, but because the enemy above him was closer and faster than anyone on that bridge had any way of knowing. While Nagumo weighs that decision, American torpedo squadrons are already in the air, flying low and slow on dead reckoning toward a fleet whose exact position they can only estimate. Engines droning over empty water with no landmark to confirm they are even headed the right direction. One after another, they find it, and one after another, they are torn apart. Torpedo Squadron 8 locates the Japanese carriers first, without fighter cover, and presses its attack anyway, dropping to wave-top height where Japanese Zeros and a wall of anti-aircraft fire can reach them with ease. Every one of its 15 aircraft is shot down. A single pilot, George Gay, survives in the water, clinging to wreckage, watching the rest of the battle unfold from a life raft with nothing to do but hope someone finds him before dark. Torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown follow and suffer nearly as badly, without a single torpedo finding its mark against a fleet that is now maneuvering hard to dodge each attack. On the bridge of Akagi, officers watch wave after wave of American aircraft come apart in flame and anti-aircraft fire, and for a few minutes it looks, unmistakably, like total victory. Japanese fighters winning every engagement, American losses mounting with nothing to show for them. What none of them yet understand is that these torpedo squadrons were never the real threat, and their sacrifice bought something the men who flew them would never live to see used: time, and a fleet of Japanese fighters pulled down to the waves at the exact altitude where they could not intercept what was coming next. Aboard Enterprise, hours earlier that same morning, Richard Best leads 32 dauntless dive bombers of Bombing Squadron 6 into the air, part of a larger strike group under the overall command of Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. The launch itself carries its own quiet tension. American commanders do not know the precise position of the Japanese carriers, only an estimate built from earlier scout reports, and pilots are sent out to search a wide arc of empty ocean with fuel gauges that will not forgive an error in navigation. Best climbs to altitude and settles into the long, uncertain transit toward a fleet that might not be where anyone expects, engines droning in formation, each pilot doing the same silent arithmetic of fuel remaining against distance covered. Below him, for the better part of an hour, there is nothing but open water, no wakes, no ships, no confirmation that this mission will find anything at all before it has to turn back. Just glare off the swells and the growing, unspoken awareness that every minute spent searching is a minute closer to a fuel gauge that will not forgive a wrong guess. Then, well past the point where the Japanese fleet was expected, McCluskey makes a decision that will later be credited as one of the most important individual judgment calls of the entire battle. Rather than turn back with fuel running low, he elects to continue searching a little longer, gambling that a slight correction in course might still locate the enemy before his squadrons have to abandon the mission and limp home. It is McCluskey who first spots a lone Japanese destroyer racing at speed to rejoin its main force, a thin white wake cutting across empty blue water, and reasons, correctly, that following that wake will lead the American squadrons directly to the carriers it is rushing to rejoin. The gamble pays off almost immediately. Below the American formation, spread across the water in a loose diamond formation, sit 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, decks crowded with aircraft, defensive fighters flown down to low altitude chasing the torpedo squadrons that sacrificed themselves minutes earlier. No one on those decks has looked up yet, and for a few more seconds, high above them, the Americans hold every advantage a strike force can hold: altitude, surprise, and an enemy looking the wrong direction entirely. McCluskey gives the order to attack, assigning targets among the ships below. Best's squadron, VB-6, is directed toward one of the larger carriers, and here the mission almost goes wrong in a way that has nothing to do with Japanese defenses at all. A second American squadron, VS-6 under Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher, has also been assigned the same target, an overlap in orders that would waste half the American strike concentrating firepower on a single ship while leaving another carrier completely untouched. From his cockpit, high above the fleet, watching Gallagher's squadron already beginning its own dive on that same target, Best recognizes the duplication in real time. There is no radio conversation to sort it out, no time for a debate over frequencies already crowded with chatter from a dozen other aircraft. There's only a few seconds to watch, calculate, and choose. He makes the decision that will define the rest of this documentary's central question. Rather than follow his own squadron into a redundant attack that would leave a second Japanese carrier completely unscathed, he pulls two of his own aircraft off the assigned target and redirects toward that second carrier several miles distant, a ship neither squadron had been ordered to strike. It is not an act of insubordination in any meaningful sense. No doctrine required him to duplicate an attack on a target already being hit, and reallocating effort toward an unengaged enemy ship is, in hindsight, sound tactical judgment. But it is entirely his own call, made alone, in the span of seconds, without confirmation from any higher authority, based on nothing more than what he could see with his own eyes at that altitude and what he judged the battle needed at that moment. That second carrier is Akagi, the flagship of the entire Japanese carrier strike force, the same ship that led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. This is the moment the opening of this documentary already showed. Best, nose down, diving from over 14,000 feet, closing on a target he was never formally assigned. What happened next is documented clearly across multiple historical accounts, Japanese and American alike. Best releases his bomb from roughly 1,500 feet, one of the lowest, most exposed release altitudes a dive bomber pilot can choose, sacrificing margin for accuracy, holding his dive several seconds longer than doctrine strictly recommended in order to be certain of the hit. The bomb strikes near Akagi's rear elevator, precisely where the flight deck opens into the hangar shaft below. A hangar still crowded with the fueled, armed aircraft Nagumo's crews had spent the morning preparing for a strike that never got the chance to launch. The explosion travels straight down into that hangar and ignites everything inside almost instantly, a column of fire and debris rising back up through the elevator shaft and across the flight deck. Within minutes, fire spread beyond anything Akagi's damage control teams can contain, smoke pouring from every hatch, the ship's own speed feeding the flames with wind across the deck. Nagumo, still aboard his flagship, resists the recommendation to abandon her for as long as the fire allows, before finally being lowered by rope to a waiting boat and transferred to a light cruiser as the ship he has led since Pearl Harbor burns behind him. Best's two wingmen score no additional hits on Akagi in this pass. The historical record credits Best's single bomb as the blow that dooms the flagship, though the two dauntlesses accompanying him deserve equal recognition for pressing an attack against a target neither had trained specifically to hit that morning. Elsewhere in the same 6-minute window, Gallagher's squadron and dive bombers from Yorktown devastate Kaga and Soryu in a nearly simultaneous sequence of hits, an outcome historians describe as one of the most decisive few minutes in naval history, in which 3 of the 4 carriers that struck Pearl Harbor are reduced to burning wrecks almost at once. Best does not know, in the moment he pulls out of his dive, that he has just helped destroy the flagship of the combined fleet. He knows only that his aircraft has cleared the target, that anti-aircraft fire is still rising around him, and that he now has to find his way back to Enterprise across open ocean with a fuel gauge that has not stopped counting down. The flight home offers no celebration, only the same quiet arithmetic every strike pilot performs on the return leg. Fuel remaining, distance to the carrier, the small but real possibility of finding empty ocean where a flight deck is supposed to be. The battle, however, is not finished, and neither is Best's role in it. Aboard Hiryu, the one Japanese carrier untouched by the morning's attack, Rear Admiral Yamamoto does not hesitate. Within the hour he launches everything his ship can put into the air, dive bombers and torpedo planes, sent out to find and destroy whichever American carrier had just launched the strike that gutted 3 of his sister ships. Japanese scout reports are imperfect, but they are enough. Hiryu's aircraft locate the Yorktown and press their attack through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Black flak bursts stitching the sky around them. Scoring bomb hits that tear open her flight deck and torpedo hits below the waterline that flood her engine spaces and bring her dead in the water, listing her damage control parties fighting fires in compartments that are rapidly filling with sea water as pumps struggle to keep pace with the flooding. For a few hours that afternoon, it looks as though Japan might yet salvage something from a catastrophic morning. One American carrier apparently crippled, perhaps sunk, in exchange for 3 of Japan's own. Yamamoto has bought his fleet a second chance, and everyone aboard Hiryu knows it will not last long unless someone finds her before American search planes do, because a single carrier operating alone, without sister ships to share the burden of searching the surrounding ocean, is exposed in a way that 4 carriers together never were. Back aboard Enterprise, Richard Best has barely landed and climbed out of his cockpit when new orders arrive. American reconnaissance has found Hiryu, and a fresh strike is being assembled to finish what the morning began. Destroy the last Japanese fleet carrier before nightfall gives her captain the chance to slip away in the dark. There is no time for a full briefing, no time for rest after a mission that has already tested every pilot's nerves and fuel reserves to their limit. Best, still in his flight gear, prepares to lead his squadron back into the air for a second strike in the same day, an extraordinary physical demand even by the standards of carrier aviation. It is during the second mission that something goes wrong that has nothing to do with Japanese defenses at all. Best's oxygen system, relied upon at the altitudes dive bombers operate from, malfunctions in a way that exposes him to caustic soda, a chemical used in some oxygen canister systems of the era to scrub carbon dioxide, and one that becomes dangerous if it leaks into the air a pilot is breathing at altitude, burning the lining of the lungs in a way that produces no immediate, dramatic symptom, only a persistent, worsening cough that will not go away in the hours that follow. Best presses on with the mission regardless, unaware of the internal damage already occurring with every breath, leading the strike against Hiryu and once again releasing his bomb with the same discipline that guided his attack on Akagi hours earlier. Hiryu, like her sister ships that morning, is caught with aircraft crowded on deck and cannot survive the hits that follow. Fires spread beyond control, and by the next morning she too slips beneath the Pacific, with Yamaguchi choosing to remain aboard rather than be rescued. Best lands back aboard Enterprise having taken part in the destruction of 2 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day, a distinction historians note no other pilot in the battle achieved. But the caustic exposure from that second mission is not something a body simply shakes off. In the days that follow, Best begins coughing blood, and medical examination reveals the chemical exposure has reactivated a latent case of tuberculosis, a condition that will end his combat flying career almost as decisively as his bombs ended 2 Japanese carriers. He is 33 years old, and June 4th, 1942 is the last day he will ever fly in combat. By nightfall on June 4th, Japan has lost all 4 of the fleet carriers that led the Pearl Harbor attack, along with more than 300 aircraft and roughly 3,000 sailors and aviators, losses that include many of the most experienced carrier pilots in the Imperial Navy, men whose skill cannot be replaced by any wartime training program in months or even years. The United States loses the Yorktown, 1 destroyer, and just over 300 personnel. Yamamoto, still hundreds of miles behind the fighting aboard his flagship Yamato, receives the news in slow, worsening fragments through the afternoon and evening, and by the time the full scale of the disaster is clear, there is no realistic path left to reversing it. He orders the remaining Japanese fleet to withdraw. The tactical outcome of June 4th, 1942 is, by any measurement available to naval historians, one of the most lopsided reversals in the history of naval warfare. 4 Japanese fleet carriers destroyed in under 24 hours, against the loss of a single American carrier that had entered the battle already damaged from an earlier engagement. But tactical outcomes and strategic consequences are not always the same thing, and it takes weeks, sometimes months, for the full weight of a single day to reveal itself. Japan does not simply lose 4 ships at Midway. It loses the trained pilots who flew from them, men who had spent a decade honing skills that no accelerated wartime program can replicate in the years remaining. It loses experienced maintenance crews, flight deck officers, and the accumulated institutional knowledge of how to operate a fleet carrier at the level Japan had spent 15 years perfecting. American shipyards, meanwhile, are only beginning to demonstrate the industrial capacity Yamamoto warned his own government about before the war ever started. A capacity that will produce more than 24 fleet and light carriers over the next 3 years, a pace Japan's shipbuilding industry can never hope to match. From June 4th onward, the Imperial Japanese Navy never again holds the initiative at sea in the Pacific. Every major naval engagement that follows, for the remainder of the war, is fought increasingly on terms the United States dictates rather than terms Japan chooses. None of that, however, answers the question this documentary opened with. Did Richard Best's decision to break formation and dive on Akagi actually change the course of the Pacific War, or has 80 years of retelling exaggerated one man's role in a battle decided by far larger forces? Historians who have studied the battle in detail do not agree on a single answer, and the honest version of this story has to hold both sides of that disagreement at once. The case for Best's individual significance begins with a simple, verifiable fact. No other pilot in the Pacific War is credited with directly contributing to the destruction of 2 enemy fleet carriers in a single day. His decision to abandon a duplicated attack and redirect toward an unassigned target was made entirely on his own judgment, without orders, in the span of seconds, and it eliminated the flagship of the entire Japanese combined fleet. The ship from which Nagumo had commanded every previous carrier operation of the war, including Pearl Harbor itself, had best followed his original orders and piled onto the same target as Gallagher's squadron. Akagi might well have survived the morning attack entirely, continuing to operate as a functioning carrier even after Kaga and Soryu were destroyed, potentially recovering aircraft, launching counterstrikes, and giving Nagumo a functioning flagship from which to direct whatever remained of the battle. Instead, 3 carriers burn within minutes of one another rather than 2, and Nagumo is forced into a light cruiser, his ability to command the remaining fight measurably diminished from the very ship he needed most in the battle's most chaotic hour. The case against overstating Best's role is equally grounded in the historical record and deserves equal weight. Even if Akagi had survived that specific morning attack, Kaga and Soryu were already doomed independently of anything Best did, struck by Gallagher's squadron and by Yorktown's dive bombers in the same narrow window of time, their hangars just as crowded, their fuel lines just as exposed. A Japanese carrier force reduced from 4 ships to 2, even without Akagi's loss, would still represent a catastrophic tactical defeat, one that many historians argue would still have forced Yamamoto to withdraw rather than continue an operation his remaining ships could not realistically sustain against 3 intact American carriers and land-based air power from Midway itself. Some scholars of the battle, most notably the authors of the widely respected study Shattered Sword, argue that the deeper causes of Japan's defeat lie not in any single pilot's choice, but in structural and institutional weaknesses that made the disaster nearly inevitable once the American strike arrived at all. Inadequate Japanese search patterns that left gaps in coverage, doctrine that prioritized offensive striking power over fire safety and damage control, fueling and rearming procedures that left no margin for the unexpected, and a rearming decision by Nagumo that left ordnance and fuel exposed across multiple decks simultaneously. By this reading, Best's choice to redirect toward Akagi was consequential and genuinely brave, but it accelerated an outcome that converging systemic failures had already made close to certain, rather than single-handedly creating that outcome from a battle that would otherwise have gone differently. There's a third, quieter argument worth including, one that avoids treating this as a binary choice between one man changed everything and nothing about him mattered. Wars are decided by the accumulation of many individual decisions made under uncertainty, most of them invisible to history, a handful of them documented well enough to examine closely, decades later, frame by frame. Joseph Rochefort's code-breaking team made a decision to trust a hunch enough to test it, and that decision gave Nimitz the information advantage the entire battle depended on. Yorktown's repair crews made a decision to compress 90 days of work into 72 hours, without which only 2 American carriers would have faced 4 Japanese ones instead of 3 facing 4, an arithmetic difference that could easily have changed the outcome of the morning entirely. Wade McCluskey made a decision to continue searching past the point his fuel reserves comfortably allowed, without which the American strike groups might never have found the Japanese fleet at all that morning, and might instead have turned for home with nothing to show for the mission. Shuichi Nagumo made a decision to prioritize a coordinated strike over an immediate, imperfect one, a choice that left his decks catastrophically exposed at the worst possible moment, made for entirely defensible reasons that simply collided with terrible timing. And Richard Best made a decision, in the middle of all of those other decisions, to trust his own eyes over his original orders and strike a target no one had assigned him. None of these men, alone, wins or loses the Battle of Midway. Together, in a sequence that took less than 6 hours to unfold from first contact to burning wreckage, they produce an outcome that no single participant, on either side, could have fully predicted or fully controlled. A chain of ordinary human judgment calls that, laid end to end, add up to one of the most consequential mornings of the entire war. Richard Best never flew in combat again after June 4, 1942. The tuberculosis triggered by his oxygen exposure during the Huryu strike keeps him hospitalized for an extended recovery, months spent in treatment while the war he can no longer fight in continues without him. Headline after headline arriving from battles he reads about instead of flies over. The Navy medically retires him from active flying duty well before the war's end, a quiet, almost anticlimactic conclusion to a combat career that lasted barely 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway, ended not by an enemy bullet but by a faulty canister valve on his own aircraft. He receives the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway, one of the highest decorations the Navy bestows, and in the decades that follow he is interviewed repeatedly by historians and authors researching the battle. His account of the mix-up over Kaga and his decision to redirect toward Akagi becoming one of the most cited first-hand testimonies used to reconstruct exactly what happened during those 6 critical minutes. He speaks about the mission plainly, without embellishment, in the manner of a man who has spent decades being asked to relive 20 seconds of his life and has learned to describe them with precision rather than drama. He lives long enough to see Midway transformed from a wartime headline into a subject of serious historical study, long enough to watch later generations debate, respectfully and sometimes contentiously, exactly how much credit belongs to him personally versus the much larger machine of intelligence, repair crews, search patterns, and command decisions that surrounded his single dive. He dies in 1989, having spent nearly half a century living with the consequences of a war that ended, for him personally, in the space of 2 missions flown on the same June morning. For decades, Akagi and Kaga rested on the floor of the Pacific, known only through the reports of the men who watched them burn, their exact final positions unrecorded, the wrecks unseen by human eyes since the morning they sank. That changed in October 2019, when a research expedition using deep-sea sonar and remotely operated vehicles located both carriers more than 15,000 feet down, their hulls remarkably preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor water at that depth. Video footage from the expedition shows sections of flight decks still recognizable after 77 years, anti-aircraft guns still mounted at their stations, a rising sun insignia still visible on part of Kaga's hull. For historians who had spent careers reconstructing this battle from written reports, radio logs, and survivor testimony, the footage offers something almost unsettling, physical confirmation, in cold and pressure-crushed steel, of a chain of events that had until then existed mostly on paper and in memory. Somewhere in that wreckage, in a section of hull near where an elevator shaft once opened onto Akagi's hangar deck, is the physical scar of the single bomb Richard Best released on the morning of June 4, 1942, a detail the sonar images cannot resolve, but one that gives the wreck a specific, personal weight beyond its size and age. Return, now, to the moment this documentary began with. 14,000 feet above the Pacific, a dauntless dive bomber tips into its descent, engine screaming, ocean rising to fill the windscreen, altimeter unwinding past 10,000 feet, past 8, past 5. Richard Best has perhaps 20 seconds left before he must release his bomb or abort the dive entirely, and in those 20 seconds nothing about the rest of the Pacific War has been decided yet. It will not be decided by this dive alone, no matter how central this dive later becomes to the story historians tell about that morning. It would be decided by codebreakers in a basement, by welders working through the night on a wounded carrier, by a squadron commander who refused to turn an empty fuel gauge, by torpedo pilots who died drawing Japanese fighters down the ways, by an admiral who made the textbook decision at exactly the wrong moment, and by one dive bomber pilot who looked down, saw a mistake about to be made, and chose, on his own judgment, in the span of a few seconds, not to make it. History rarely turns on a single decision by a single person, but every so often, in the space of 20 seconds above an empty stretch of ocean, it comes close enough that the difference stops feeling academic and starts feeling personal, close enough that 80 years later, people are still asking whether one man, diving alone toward a ship he was never ordered to hit, quietly changed the outcome of a war that the rest of the world was still fighting for 3 more years without ever knowing his name.